The morning Charlotte Gentry walked into the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882. She was wearing her dead husband's boots because her own had worn clean through the soles, and she carried in her hands the last shred of dignity she had left in this world. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead of sweat on a hard man's brow, and it smelled of cattle and dust, and the particular kind of desperation that settled over a place when too many people had passed through it and left their troubles behind. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons abreast, and on either side of it stood the rough-hewn facades of civilization trying very hard to be taken seriously. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that never seemed to close, a church that never seemed to open, and the bank, the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, which stood at the corner of Front Street and Commerce Avenue with its freshly whitewashed exterior and its painted sign, looking like a promise that the land itself had never quite kept. Charlotte was 31 years old. She had hair the color of dark honey that she kept pinned tightly beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, and eyes the color of the Kansas sky in August, not the hopeful blue of morning, but the deep, tired blue of late afternoon when the heat has had its way with everything. She was not a small woman, not fragile, not the kind of woman men looked at and immediately wanted to protect. She had been built for work, wide-shouldered and strong-handed, and the 3 years she had spent trying to keep the Gentry homestead alive after her husband Thomas had died of a fever in the winter of 1879 had not softened her any. Thomas Gentry had been a good man. Not a clever one, not a lucky one, but a good one. He had brought Charlotte west from Missouri in 1876 when they were both young and full of the particular madness that passes for optimism in people who have not yet been truly tested. He had borrowed money from the First Territorial Bank to buy their parcel of land, 160 acres of promise along Salt Creek, and he had worked that land with everything he had. And then the fever had taken him in January of 1879, leaving Charlotte alone with their daughter Lily, who was 4 at the time, and a debt to the bank that seemed to grow larger every time she looked at it. For 3 years Charlotte had held on. She had planted and harvested and taken in laundry from the town and sold eggs and done every manner of work that a woman alone could do in a place like Caldwell without it costing her more than she had. She had not asked anyone for help. She had not gone to church suppers looking for a new husband. She had not sold Thomas's land, which every man in town had at one point or another suggested she do with the particular tone that men reserve for suggestions that are actually instructions. She had held on, but the winter of 1881 into 1882 had been brutal. A blizzard in December had killed 6 of her 8 chickens. The cold had cracked her well casing, and it had cost her the last of her emergency funds to have it repaired. Her crop of winter wheat had failed entirely, and now it was April, and the bank's quarterly payment was 3 weeks past due, and the letter she had received from the bank 10 days ago had been precise and unmerciful in its language. Either the payment was made in full by the end of the month, or proceedings would begin to reclaim the property. So she had dressed herself in her best remaining dress, a dark green wool that was too heavy for the warming spring air, but was the only dress she owned without visible mending on its front, and she had put on Thomas's boots because they fit her well enough if she wore 2 pairs of stockings, and she had left Lily in the care of old Mrs. Hawthorne next door, and she had driven her mule, a bad-tempered animal named Jericho, the 4 miles into town. She had told herself on the drive in that she would not beg. She had repeated it like a prayer, like a piece of scripture she was committing to memory. She would not beg. She would explain her situation clearly and ask for a reasonable extension, and she would be dignified about it. She was Charlotte Gentry, and she did not beg. She tied Jericho to the post outside the bank, smoothed her skirt with both hands, took a breath that cost her more than it should have, and walked inside. The interior of the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell was the kind of space designed to make a person feel the full weight of their circumstances. The floor was polished oak, darker than the street mud it was meant to contrast with, and the ceiling was high enough to make you aware of how small you were beneath it. There were two teller windows, both occupied by young men in nearly identical gray vests, and at the back of the room was a wooden railing with a swinging gate, and beyond that railing was a large oak desk, and behind that desk was Robert Dawson. Charlotte had seen Robert Dawson before, in the way that everyone in a town of 2,000 people had seen everyone else, at the general store, passing on the street, at the one town meeting she had attended 2 years ago when there had been talk of a new water easement. She had noticed him the way you notice a well-built structure, with a kind of unconscious acknowledgement of solidity. He was 36 years old, though he looked younger when he smiled and older when he was concentrating, which was most of the time. He was tall, lean in the manner of a man who had spent years outdoors before spending years indoors, and he had dark hair that was just beginning to touch silver at the temples. His face was angular, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness and eyes brown, warm, and disconcertingly attentive. That suggested something rather more complicated. He had come to Caldwell from Austin, Texas, 4 years ago, brought in by the Territorial Banking Association to take over from old Clarence Hatch, who had drunk himself out of a position and into a grave with admirable efficiency. Robert Dawson had a reputation in Caldwell for being fair but immovable, which was more or less what a bank manager's reputation ought to be. He was not married. He had never been married. The women of the town had opinions about this, most of them favorable and hopeful, and he endured their opinions with the quiet patience of a man who had learned that not every storm requires shelter. He was reviewing a ledger when Charlotte walked in, and he looked up with the automatic attention of a man accustomed to being the first and final authority in a room, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly when he saw her. Not pity, not recognition in the social sense, but something more careful than either. He set down his pen. "Good morning," he said. "Can I help you?" Charlotte squared her shoulders. "I am Charlotte Gentry. I hold a note with this bank on 160 acres along Salt Creek. I am behind on my quarterly payment, and I received your bank's letter." She paused just long enough to take the kind of breath that you take when you are trying not to drown. "I would like to speak with you about an extension." Robert Dawson looked at her for a moment that lasted 3 beats longer than was strictly comfortable, and then he stood, which surprised her, and gestured toward the chair on the other side of his desk. "Please sit down, Mrs. Gentry." She sat. He sat. Between them was the oak desk and the ledger and the particular silence of a conversation that matters. He opened a different ledger, the one with the property loans, and found her file with the practiced ease of a man who knew his books by heart. He read for a moment without speaking. Charlotte watched his face the way you watch the sky when you are not certain what weather is coming. "Your note was originated in 1876, he said. "The original amount was $480 at 8% interest, with quarterly payments due at the start of each season." He looked up. "You have made every payment on time for 5 years, Mrs. Gentry, until this past quarter." "My husband died in 1879, Charlotte said. "I have been managing the property alone since then." "I know," he said. "I know who you are and I know your situation." There was something about the way he said it that was not condescending. That was not the particular weary patience of a man who had heard too many hard luck stories and had stopped believing them. It sounded, instead, like he had genuinely taken stock of it, the way a man takes stock of terrain before deciding which way to walk. "How much is the payment?" she asked, though she knew. $42.60 plus the late fee, which brings it to $47. $47. She had $11.30 in the tin box she kept beneath the floorboard of her kitchen. She had a pair of pearl earrings that Thomas had given her on their wedding day that she would rather have died than sell. She had 160 acres of Kansas prairie that the bank was about to take from her. "I cannot pay it today," she said. "I know that. What I am asking is for time. Not a forgiveness of the debt, not a renegotiation of the terms. Just time. I have a kitchen garden that will be ready by June. I have a neighbor, Mr. Hendricks, who has offered to lease 12 acres of my south pasture for summer grazing, and that would bring in $30. I have every intention of paying every cent that I owe with interest, and my record with this bank over 5 years demonstrates that intention plainly. I am asking for 60 days. She did not beg. She had not begged. She had presented her case the way a careful woman presents anything, with the facts arranged neatly, without embellishment, without desperation showing through any more than she could help. Robert Dawson looked at her for a long moment. His fingers were resting lightly on the edge of the ledger, not drumming, not fidgeting, just resting. He had a quality of stillness about him that she would later come to understand was the thing she had first recognized without naming the stillness of a man who was actually listening. "You said Mr. Hendricks would pay $30 for the south pasture," he said. "Yes." "When?" "He said he could have the first payment by the 15th of May before he moved the cattle. That's 3 weeks." "Yes." He closed the ledger. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not read, and she found, to her irritation, that she very much wanted to read it. "Mrs. Gentry," he said, "I'm going to grant you a 60-day extension on your payment, with no additional penalty beyond the existing late fee, which I am willing to defer to the end of the extension period." Charlotte's hands, which had been folded very carefully and very still in her lap, tightened briefly. She felt a surge of something that was not quite relief, because relief implies that you were sure the danger was real, and she had been sure the danger was real. It was more like the feeling of stepping back from an edge you had not realized you were standing on. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level. She was very proud of how level it was. "There is one condition," he said. She stiffened. Because of course there was, and she should have known. And what was she going to do when whatever condition it was turned out to be something she could not accept? She looked at him with the careful neutrality of a woman who has learned to keep her face composed while her thoughts run at a full gallop. Robert Dawson, who was watching her face with that same disconcerting attention he had given her from the moment she walked in, seemed to understand exactly what she was thinking, because his expression shifted into something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile. "I would like for you to have supper with me," he said. The silence stretched. "I beg your pardon." Charlotte said, "Supper," he said. "This evening if you are free, or another evening if you are not. I am aware that this is an unusual request, and I want to be clear that it is completely separate from the extension, which is yours regardless. I am not making one contingent on the other. I am simply asking." Charlotte studied him. She studied him the way she would study a piece of land she was thinking of planting, looking for the quality of the soil beneath the surface, the signs of what it would yield and what it would cost. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I have watched you drive past this bank on your way to the general store for 3 years, he said, "and I have never once found a sufficient reason to speak to you, and I think I have just been given one." It was not a slick answer. It was not the kind of thing a practiced flatterer says. It had the rough, unpolished quality of the truth, and it hit her somewhere under her ribs in a way she was not prepared for, and she was angry about that briefly and privately before she set the anger aside. "My daughter will need to be collected by 5, she said. "She stays with Mrs. Hawthorne on Commerce Street. "I can have you back by 4, he said. "Then I suppose supper would be acceptable," Charlotte said. And the way she said it, with that careful, composed dignity that had carried her through 3 years of widowhood and one very consequential morning, made Robert Dawson press his lips together briefly in the expression of a man who is preventing himself from smiling too broadly. She stood, and he stood, because that was the kind of man he was, and they looked at each other across the oak desk, and the ledger and the $47 that no longer had the power to take her land, and Charlotte Gentry, who had come into the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882, fully expecting to lose everything, walked out into the spring sunshine with her extension, and something else entirely that she had not been expecting at all. Something she had not had the foresight to guard against. She drove Jericho back toward Mrs. Hawthorne's house, and she caught herself thinking about the quality of Robert Dawson's eyes, and then she told herself very firmly to stop it, and she stopped it mostly for approximately 4 minutes before she started again. The rest of the morning was taken up with practical things. She collected Lily from Mrs. Hawthorne's, which took longer than expected because Lily was 7 years old and had found a cat in Mrs. Hawthorne's garden that she was deeply reluctant to leave behind, and Charlotte had to negotiate the departure with the diplomatic precision of a treaty conference. Lily was a small, dark-haired child with her father's eyes and Charlotte's stubbornness, which was a combination that made her exhausting and wonderful in approximately equal measure. She sat beside Charlotte on the wagon seat and asked 14 separate questions about the bank and whether the bank was nice, and whether the man at the bank was nice, and whether Charlotte had been nervous, and whether Charlotte had cried. "I did not cry," Charlotte said. "I would have cried," Lily said. "I know," Charlotte said. "Did the man say it was all right?" "He said we have 60 days. Lily considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has learned that some good news is the kind that still requires you to keep working. "Is 60 days enough?" "It will have to be," Charlotte said. When they got home, Charlotte set Lily to gathering what eggs remained from her depleted flock, which would amount to 5 at best, and went inside to look at the kitchen garden that was just beginning to show green through the dark soil. She had planted carrots and onions and beans and 2 rows of potatoes, and the seedlings were coming in thin but promising. By June, there would be enough to sell at the market on Saturdays. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to be one of several things that together added up to something. She thought about Robert Dawson, standing when she came to sit at his desk, because men with authority did not always remember to do that and often did not bother. She thought about the way he had said, "Because I have watched you drive past this bank on your way to the general store for 3 years," which meant he had noticed her, which meant he had been paying attention all that time without her knowing. She was not sure how she felt about being noticed without knowing it. She had spent 3 years very carefully being only as visible as necessity required. Being visible meant being available to opinions, to advice, to the particular attentions of men who saw a widow alone on a piece of land and calculated the arithmetic of it. She had not wanted to be calculated, but that was not quite what Robert Dawson had described. He had not described calculation. He had described something quieter, more private, something closer to admiration, she thought, and then felt the word too large for the moment and tried to find a smaller one and could not quite manage it. She made a simple dinner for herself and Lily, bean soup and cornbread, and she told Lily that she was going out to supper that evening with someone from town and that Mrs. Hawthorne would come to sit with her. Lily, who was eating her cornbread with the focused intensity she brought to all food-related activities, looked up. "Who?" "A man named Mr. Dawson. He works at the bank." "Is he the man who said 60 days is all right?" "Yes," Lily chewed. "Why is he taking you to supper?" "He asked me." "Why?" Charlotte set down her spoon. "Lily." "That's a reasonable question," Lily said, in the exact tone Charlotte herself used to shut down an argument which was unsettling. "He was kind to me this morning," Charlotte said carefully, "and I think he would like to be better acquainted." Lily appeared to find this satisfactory, or at least not worth further investigation, because she returned to her cornbread without further comment. But as Charlotte was washing the dishes later, with Lily sitting at the kitchen table working through her reading primer, the little girl said, without looking up, "Does he know about Papa?" Charlotte looked out the window at the darkening yard. "Everyone in Caldwell knows about your Papa," she said. "Grief is not a private matter in a small town, I'm afraid." "That's sad," Lily said. "Yes," Charlotte agreed. "In some ways it is, Mrs. Hawthorne arrived at 5 minutes to 6, a small, round woman of 62 who had the energy of someone considerably younger and the opinions of someone who had been storing them up for decades. She took one look at Charlotte in her green dress, hair neatly repinned, and said, "Well, it's about time," with the air of someone who had been waiting for this specific event and was pleased to have been proven right. "It is only supper," Charlotte said. "Everything is only supper until it isn't," Mrs. Hawthorne said, and settled herself in the rocking chair by the fire with the complete self-satisfaction of a woman who has said a true thing and knows it. Charlotte drove herself back into town, because it was still light enough and because she had not wanted to put Robert Dawson to the trouble of collecting her, and because driving herself meant she arrived on her own terms, which mattered to her in ways she couldn't entirely have explained. She tied Jericho outside the Caldwell Hotel, which had a dining room that was the closest thing the town had to a proper restaurant, and she went inside. He was already there. He was sitting at a table near the window, and he had changed out of his working clothes into a dark suit that was clearly his good one, the kind that you wear for things that count. He stood when he saw her because that was what he did. She was beginning to understand, and she noticed that he had combed his hair with particular care, and the effort of it, the small, entirely human effort of it, did something unexpected to the armor she had been wearing all day. "Mrs. Gentry," he said. "Mr. Dawson," she said. They sat across from each other in the Caldwell Hotel dining room with its oilcloth tablecloths and its single candle in a tin holder and the muffled sound of the kitchen behind the far door. And a young girl named Mary, who was the proprietor's daughter, came and told them that the evening supper was roast chicken or salt pork, and cornbread and beans, and peach pie if they wanted it. They both asked for the chicken and the beans and the pie. And then they were alone again with the candle between them, and Charlotte said, "I want to tell you something before we go any further with this evening, Mr. Dawson." "All right," he said. "I am not a woman who is looking for assistance," she said. "I came to the bank today because I had no other reasonable option, and I want you to know that because I do not want there to be any confusion about what I am and what I am not. I am not a widow in need of rescue. I am a woman in a difficult financial season who needed 60 days, which you have provided, and for which I am genuinely grateful. But I want to be clear that I am here at supper because you asked me, not because I feel I owe you anything." Robert Dawson listened to all of this without interrupting, which was, she would later think, one of the first things that separated him from most men she had known. He waited until she was fully finished, and then he said, "Mrs. Gentry, I did not ask you to supper because I thought you needed rescuing. I asked you to supper because this morning you walked into my bank looking like you expected the floor to give way beneath you, and you were so determined not to let it show that you were practically vibrating with the effort of it, and I thought to myself, that is a woman I would very much like to know." Charlotte looked at him. The candle flame was very still between them, the air in the hotel dining room warm and close and smelling of cooking food and wood smoke. "That is," she said carefully, "a fairly honest thing to say." "I find honesty easier than the alternative," he said. "The alternative requires keeping track of too many things." She almost smiled. She caught it before it got too wide, but she felt it in her face and she suspected he could see it too. "All right," she said. "Then I will try to be equally honest with you." "I would appreciate that," he said. "I have not had supper with anyone other than my daughter in almost 3 years," she said. "I am somewhat out of practice with this." She gestured between them vaguely, meaning the candlelight and the careful clothes and the expectation of conversation. "Then we will practice," he said simply, and there was such uncomplicated goodwill in it that Charlotte felt the last of the stiffness she had been carrying all day begin, very slowly, to ease. They talked for 2 hours. Mary brought the food and they ate and they talked, and then Mary brought the peach pie and they ate that too and kept talking. Charlotte learned that Robert Dawson had grown up in Austin, the second of 4 sons of a man who had run a dry goods business. He had studied mathematics and accounting at a small college in San Antonio, which was not common for men of his background, and which he credited to the influence of a schoolteacher named Mr. Holloway, who had seen something in him and pushed him toward it. He had worked for the Texas and Pacific Railroad's financial division for several years before the Territorial Banking Association had recruited him for Caldwell. He liked books, particularly history. He did not like cards. He had a brother in Colorado who wrote letters about mining prospects that always sounded more promising than they turned out to be. He had a horse named Caesar that he rode every morning before the bank opened, because he found that the morning and the motion together did something useful for his thinking. He learned about Charlotte. Not everything, because she was not the kind of person who gave everything at once, but enough. He learned that she had come from St. Louis, not Missouri as he had thought, and that her father had been a schoolteacher and her mother had run a boarding house, and that she had met Thomas Gentry at a barn dance when she was 22, and thought he was the most straightforward man she had ever encountered, and she had meant that as a compliment. He learned that she could read and write better than most men in Caldwell, and that she had taught herself basic bookkeeping from a manual she had found in Thomas's things. He learned that Lily was the most important thing in her world, and that she was funny about this, fierce and self-deprecating at the same time. He learned that she had not been happy since Thomas died, not the kind of happy that lives in your body and not just your head, and that she had gotten so accustomed to that quality of not quite happiness that she had almost stopped noticing it. She did not tell him that last part in so many words, but he was listening carefully enough to hear it in the shape of the other things she said, and he stored it away in the thoughtful, quiet manner in which he stored everything that seemed important. When the evening was over and they stood outside the hotel in the cool April night, with the stars very bright and the sound of the saloon down the street throbbing like a bad tooth, Robert Dawson said, "Would you be willing to have supper with me again?" Charlotte looked at him in the starlight. He had his hat in his hands, which she suspected was less about weather and more about not quite knowing what to do with his hands, which she found, to her surprise, rather endearing. "I think I would," she said. "Yes." He smiled then, the full version of it, and it changed his face in a way she had not been expecting, opening it up like a landscape that turns out to be larger than the horizon suggested. "Then I will look forward to it," he said. She drove home through the April dark with Jericho clip-clopping steadily beneath the stars, and she let herself be honest, alone in the dark, in the way she had not been able to be honest all evening. She was frightened. Not of him, not of the specific person of Robert Dawson, but of the feeling he had produced in her, which was the first new feeling of its kind she had experienced since Thomas, and it was disorienting in the way that warmth is disorienting when you have been cold for so long that you had started to think of the cold as your natural state. She was not ready to be warm. She did not know if she would ever be ready. But she had agreed to supper again, and that was something, and she held it carefully in her chest on the drive home, the way you carry a lit lantern on a windy night, protecting the flame from your own movements. The weeks that followed were full, in the way that spring on a homestead is always full, with the kind of work that has no end to it. Charlotte planted the last of her kitchen garden and patched the fence on the north pasture, where the winter had worked it loose in 3 places. She went to town on Saturdays to sell what eggs and early produce she could manage, and she took in 2 new laundry customers, the preacher Aldman and his wife who had newly arrived in Caldwell, which added $8 a month to her income. Mr. Hendricks, true to his word, sent his man over on the 15th of May with $30 in cash for the south pasture lease, and Charlotte stood at her kitchen table with the money in her hands and felt the particular, exhausting relief of having done what you said you were going to do. She counted it 3 times, then put 20 of it in the tin box and set the rest aside for supplies. She saw Robert Dawson 6 times in the space of those 6 weeks, which was not a great number, but was more than enough for two people who were paying close attention. They had supper 3 more times at the Caldwell Hotel, and once they went riding, he on Caesar, who was a tall bay with a calm temperament, and she on Jericho, who was neither tall nor calm but got the job done out along the creek where the cottonwoods were coming into full leaf, and the water was high and golden with reflected afternoon light. Lily came on the riding excursion because Charlotte was not going to leave her out of things that happened in daylight, and Lily took one long look at Robert Dawson, who had crouched down to her height to say good morning to her, and said, "You're taller than you look," which Robert appeared to find genuinely funny. "I get that a lot," he told her, which was almost certainly not true but was the right thing to say. Lily had approved of him from that moment forward with the uncomplicated certainty that children reserve for people who do not talk down to them. She referred to him as Mr. Dawson, very formally, and at supper one evening announced to Charlotte that Mr. Dawson had a very nice horse and that she wished to learn to ride someday, which Charlotte suspected was at least partly a conversational gambit to create a future scenario involving Robert Dawson and horses. Charlotte did not correct this maneuver. She stored it away with everything else she was storing. It was on the 4th supper, at the hotel again with Mary serving them, and the evening warm enough that the windows were open to the street sounds, that Robert Dawson reached across the table and put his hand over hers, very briefly, and then as though he had not quite planned it, and then he left it there when she did not pull away. Charlotte looked at their hands on the table. His was larger than hers, darker from the morning rides, with a small scar along the left knuckle that she wanted to ask about but saved for later. She looked up at his face. He was watching her with that careful, warm attention she had begun to think of as his specific quality, the thing about him that was entirely his own. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am in the very early stages of being in considerable trouble with regard to you, Mr. Dawson." He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who has been hoping for a very specific thing and has been informed that it is coming. "I have been in considerable trouble with regard to you since April," he said. "It seems only fair that you catch up," she laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and she covered her mouth with her free hand because it surprised her, the sound of herself laughing like that, spontaneously, in a way she had not done in years. Robert Dawson was still holding her other hand, and his expression when she laughed was the kind of expression that a man does not perform, that lives only in his face when he is looking at the one person who produces it. "Charlotte," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it sat differently in her chest than everything else he had said, sitting deeper, striking something that had been still for a long time. "Robert," she said, and trying his name on was like wearing something new that fits better than expected. Outside the window, a cowboy was riding down Front Street with more haste than the late hour called for, his boots kicking up dust from the dry, packed earth, and the familiar sounds of Caldwell in the evening drifted through. A burst of laughter from the saloon, the distant sound of a dog, the creak of a wagon. All of it the ordinary texture of life in a cattle town in 1882, and somehow it was the most beautiful backdrop Charlotte had ever sat in front of. She turned her hand over under his and held it properly, and they sat like that while Mary brought the pie and pretended, very professionally, not to notice. When June came, Charlotte paid the full quarterly payment at the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, including the deferred late fee in cash, which she counted out at Robert Dawson's desk while he sat across from her, and entered it carefully in the ledger. And she felt the full weight of what it meant to have done it, to have managed it, to have held on through the winter and the hard spring and come out the other side with the land still hers and the debt reduced and her record restored. Robert Dawson looked up from the ledger. "Payment received in full," he said formally, with appropriate notation in the record. "Thank you," Charlotte said, equally formally, and then they looked at each other and she watched the professional face give way to the private one, and she stood and he stood, and without any particular plan or premeditation, he leaned across the oak desk and kissed her, briefly, warmly, a press of his mouth against hers that tasted like the morning and something much better than either of them had been expecting. Then they straightened up on their respective sides of the desk, both of them slightly dazed, as though they had each independently walked into a doorframe. "That was not," he said, "entirely proper behavior for a bank manager." "No," she agreed, "it was not. Do you object?" "I find that I do not," she said. The summer of 1882 was the most alive Charlotte Gentry had felt since before Thomas died, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it, even as she was careful about how much of it she let show in public. This was Caldwell, after all, and people talked, and she had Lily to think about, and she was a woman with a practical nature that did not dissolve entirely just because she happened to be falling in love with the town's bank manager. Because she was falling in love with him. She admitted this to herself on a morning in July while she was hoeing the kitchen garden in the early cool before the day's heat set in, and the admission had the quality of something that had been true for some time and was only now being said aloud in the private space of her own head. She loved the way he thought before he spoke. She loved that he had read more history than any other man she had met west of the Mississippi. She loved that he had a dry, quiet humor that appeared at unexpected moments and always caught her off guard. She loved that he was as good with Lily as he was with her, which was perhaps more important than any other thing. Lily had started asking about Robert Dawson's horse with increasing regularity, and one Sunday in August, Robert had arrived at the homestead on horseback with Caesar, and also with a small, gentle pony he had borrowed from the livery. And he had spent 3 hours teaching Lily to ride in the south pasture while Charlotte leaned on the fence and watched, and something in the sight of him, patient and steady and laughing at Lily's commentary, had moved through her so completely that she had to turn away for a moment and look at the wide Kansas sky and get herself back under control. That evening, after Lily was in bed, Charlotte and Robert sat on the porch steps in the summer dark and talked, the way they had gotten into the habit of talking whenever he came out to the homestead, which was most Sundays now and occasionally a Saturday evening. The lightning bugs were signaling in the tall grass at the edge of the garden, and the air smelled of summer and earth and the faint sweetness of the white clover Charlotte had let grow along the fence line. "I need to say something to you," Robert said. Charlotte was watching the lightning bugs. "All right. I want to be clear with you about my intentions," he said, in the careful way he had of saying things that mattered. "Because I am not a man who does things halfway, and I would rather say this now than have it come as any kind of surprise later." "You sound like you're reading from a legal document," she said, not unkindly. He exhaled a small sound that was almost a laugh. "Forgive me. I have been composing this for 2 weeks." He paused, then said it plain. "Charlotte, I intend to ask you to marry me. Not tonight. I know it's too soon for that. But I am telling you now because I want you to know it, and because it seems to me that you are a woman who deserves to know exactly what she's walking toward." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. The lightning bugs went on signaling in the grass. "How long have you been thinking about this?" she asked. "Since May," he said, "possibly since April." "That is," she said, "rather fast." "I know," he said. "I am aware of that. I'm also 36 years old, and when something seems true, I find I don't have a great deal of patience for waiting to be certain of it." She looked at him in the dark. His profile was clear against the lighter dark of the sky, jaw and cheekbone and the line of his nose, and she thought of all the things she knew about him now, and all the things she was still learning, and how learning them did not diminish her interest but increased it, like a landscape that gets more interesting the closer you walk into it. "I have to think about Lily," she said. "I know," he said. "I would think less of you if you didn't. And I have to think about what marrying again means for the land. The note is in my name and I want it to remain. I want to be clear about my financial standing. I want it to be mine." "I would never interfere with that," he said. "The land is yours. Whatever you built on it and whatever you will build on it is yours, and I want no part of it that you do not freely give." She believed him. That was the thing, that was what made all the difference, was that she believed him. "I am not saying no," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I heard that." She reached over in the dark and found his hand and held it, and they sat on the porch steps of the Gentry homestead in the Kansas summer night, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and it was one of the finest silences Charlotte had ever sat inside of. In September, there was trouble. It came, as trouble in cattle country generally did, in the form of a man on a horse. His name was Curtis Hale, and he was a land speculator from Wichita who had been working his way through the county, buying up homestead parcels from farmers who were struggling, and he had an eye on Charlotte's 160 acres along Salt Creek. He had approached her once the previous year and she had turned him down flat, and now he came back with a different angle. He came to the bank first, which was where Charlotte learned about it, from Robert, who told her at supper that same evening with his jaw set in the way it went when he was carefully controlling his temper. "He came in this morning," Robert said, "and suggested that if you were unable to make your payments through the fall, he would be willing to purchase your note from the bank and take the land directly." Charlotte set down her fork. "He wanted to buy my debt. He presented it as a courtesy to the bank," Robert said. "He was very smooth about it." "What did you say?" "I told him that your account was current and not under any distress and that there was no note to purchase," Robert said. "And then I told him as politely as I could manage that he was welcome to leave." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "He will go to the land office next," she said. "He will look for any encumbrance he can find, anything he can use." "He can look," Robert said. "Your title is clean. I checked myself after he left." She looked at him. "You checked my title?" The moment he walked out the door, something moved through her that was not just gratitude, that was deeper than gratitude, that had to do with the knowledge of being looked after by someone who had thought to look before being asked. She had been so entirely on her own for so long that the simple fact of someone checking her title the moment a threat appeared was so startling in its care that she had to look away from him for a moment to compose herself. "I am going to the land office myself tomorrow," she said. "I want to see the file myself." "I'll come with you," he said. "Robert, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to." She did not argue with him, because she was learning that there was a difference between accepting help as charity and accepting company as the thing it was, someone choosing to stand beside you because that was where they wanted to be. They went to the land office the next morning, and Charlotte examined her own file with the methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, and the title was clean, and the record was intact. The land officer, a thin young man named Peters who was mildly intimidated by both of them, confirmed that no inquiries had been filed against the property. On the way out of the land office, they encountered Curtis Hale on the boardwalk, which was either coincidence or calculation, and given that Curtis Hale had the eyes of a man who calculated everything, Charlotte was inclined toward the latter. He was a tall man with a trimmed beard and expensive boots, and the particular confidence of someone who has bought and sold enough things that he has started to think of everything as purchasable, including people's circumstances. He tipped his hat at Charlotte with elaborate politeness. "Mrs. Gentry, I understand you and the bank manager have come to look over your file. My title is clean and my account is current," Charlotte said. "In case that was a question you were working up to." Curtis Hale's pleasant expression did not shift exactly, but something behind it recalculated. He glanced at Robert Dawson, who was standing slightly to Charlotte's left with his arms at his sides, and the expression of a man who will remain entirely civil for exactly as long as civility serves a purpose. "I simply want to offer a fair price," Hale said. "The land along Salt Creek is well situated. I am prepared to pay market value and more." "It is not for sale," Charlotte said. "It has not been for sale and it will not be for sale. I want to be very clear with you about that." "The frontier can be difficult for a woman alone," Hale said, with the particular kind of sympathy that is actually a threat wearing a polite hat. Robert stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, not in a way that was theatrical, but with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has decided that he is now included in this conversation. "Mrs. Gentry is not alone," he said, "and I would suggest that your energy might be better spent elsewhere in the county." The two men looked at each other for a moment, and something passed between them that was clear to everyone present without a word being spoken. And then Curtis Hale smiled his smooth smile and tipped his hat again and walked on down the boardwalk. And Charlotte watched him go with the controlled expression of a woman who does not show fear to people who are trying to use it. "He'll try something else," she said. "Let him try," Robert said. "Your position is solid." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, and this time the thank you was bigger than the occasion seemed to require, because it was not just for this morning. Robert understood that. She could see him understand it. He nodded once, and they walked back toward the bank in the September morning, and a cowboy on a gray horse passed them going the other direction, and the dust of Front Street rose and settled around them as they walked, and Charlotte thought that the world, right now, in this exact moment, felt almost perfectly balanced. Curtis Hale did not give up immediately. He made one more attempt in October, this time through a lawyer in Wichita who wrote Charlotte a letter suggesting that certain irregularities in the original survey of her land might make the title contestable. Charlotte read this letter at the kitchen table, then read it again, and then sat very still for several minutes. The next morning she drove to town and went to see Robert, not at the bank but at the small house he rented on Oak Street, because it was a Sunday and the bank was closed. He read the letter standing in his parlor with his morning coffee going cold on the mantelpiece, and when he was finished reading it, he folded it carefully along its original creases and said, "This is a manufactured concern. There are no irregularities in your survey. I know the surveyor who filed it. He is meticulous." "But could they contest it?" Charlotte asked. "They can contest anything," Robert said. "That is what lawyers are for. But to actually prevail, they would need to demonstrate a material error, and there is none. This is a tactic to frighten you into selling." He handed the letter back to her. "I can recommend a lawyer here in Caldwell who handles property matters if you want one on your side." "Can I afford one?" she said, which was the real question. He looked at her steadily. "I know the man. His name is James Aldred. He would not charge you anything before the matter is resolved, and if it goes nowhere, as I believe it will, there would be nothing to charge." "You are going to vouch for me with your friend," Charlotte said. "He is an acquaintance," Robert said, with the careful distinction that meant friendship. "And yes," Charlotte held his gaze for a moment. "Robert," she said, "I want you to know that I see what you do. I want you to know that I understand it and that I do not take it for granted." Something in his face shifted, something that was usually composed and steady, and she saw beneath it for just a moment the thing he usually kept quiet, which was that her opinion of him mattered more to him than almost anything else in his world. He set down the cold coffee and he crossed his parlor and he took her face in his hands and kissed her, not the brief warm press of the bank desk, but a real kiss. A kiss that knew what it was doing and where it was going, and Charlotte kissed him back with everything she had not been saying out loud for 6 months. When they drew apart, she was holding the front of his shirt with both hands, and he had his forehead against hers, and both of them were breathing like they had been running. "Charlotte," he said. "I know," she said. She did know. She knew exactly. James Aldred, who turned out to be a compact, clever man with spectacles and an office above the hardware store, reviewed the situation and wrote back to the Wichita lawyer with a letter that was, by all accounts, extremely thorough on the subject of why the claim had no merit. By November, Curtis Hale had moved his attentions to a different property 20 miles south, and Charlotte's land was no longer under any threat. She had James Aldred's bill in hand, which was very modest, and she paid it herself without asking Robert for anything. The fall harvest was not abundant, but it was decent. She brought in enough from the kitchen garden and the egg sales, and the laundry to make the October quarterly payment on time with $12 to spare, which she added to the tin box. The south pasture lease had ended with Hendricks's cattle moving south for winter, but the $30 it had generated had been the key that unlocked the first part of everything else. On a Saturday evening in November, with the first frost on the ground and the sky the pewter gray of a coming winter, Robert Dawson arrived at the Gentry homestead with a covered dish from the hotel kitchen that Mary had prepared for him, because he had asked her to, because he had decided on something. Charlotte met him at the door. Lily was inside at the kitchen table doing her arithmetic, and she waved at Robert through the window with the particular enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who approves of a situation. He came inside and they set the dish on the table. It was a roast chicken, which made Charlotte laugh at the echo of their first supper, and Lily immediately began investigating it with her fork and her running commentary. And it was the most domestic scene Charlotte had inhabited in years, and she felt it in every part of herself, all the way down to Thomas's boots, which she was still wearing, because they fit well and she had grown fond of them. After supper, while Lily was occupied with the slate and the chalk and the arithmetic that she claimed to hate but was secretly good at, Robert said quietly to Charlotte, "Will you walk outside with me for a moment?" She went. They stood on the porch in the November cold, the stars very sharp and the moon just rising over the flat horizon, and Robert reached into his coat pocket and took out something small and held it toward her. It was a ring, gold, with a small pale stone that caught the moonlight. Simple, not elaborate, the kind of ring chosen by a man with good taste and no interest in excess. "This was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me when I left Austin. She told me she was giving it to me because she trusted me to know what to do with it when the time came." He paused. "I have known since the summer, Charlotte, and I should have asked you sooner, and I am asking you now. Will you marry me?" Charlotte looked at the ring in his outstretched hand, and she looked at his face above it, and she thought of everything she had come through to stand on this porch in November, and she thought of Thomas, who had been good and kind and whose memory she would always carry with her, and she thought of Lily inside at the table with her chalk, and she thought of Robert on Sunday mornings bringing his whole attention to the world in front of him, and she thought of the feeling she had in the vicinity of him, which was the feeling of being seen. Not as a widow with a debt and a struggling farm, but as herself, as the full and complicated person she had always been underneath the circumstances. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Robert." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit as though it had been made for her, and he pulled her close and held her in the November cold, and she felt his heart under her ear, beating with the steadiness she had come to love about him, steady and sure and not going anywhere. "I have one condition," she said against his coat. "Tell me," he said. "The land stays in my name," she said. "Our household, whatever we build together, that is ours. But the land is mine, and I want it to remain mine, because Thomas worked it and I worked it and it cost us both something, and I need to keep that." "Agreed," Robert said, without a moment's hesitation. Without question. She tilted her head up to look at him. "Just like that. Just like that," he said. "It was never my land to have an opinion about." She kissed him then, and behind the window Lily looked up from her arithmetic and saw them on the porch and immediately went back to her arithmetic with a studied nonchalance that fooled absolutely no one. They told Lily the next morning at breakfast. Charlotte had thought about how to do it and had concluded that the straightforward approach was the only one Lily would respect, which was true. She sat her daughter down with her porridge and said, "Lily, Mr. Dawson has asked me to marry him and I have said yes. We would all live together here on the homestead. How do you feel about that?" Lily ate one spoonful of porridge. Then she said, "Will I still call him Mr. Dawson?" Robert, who was sitting across the table, said, "You can call me whatever you'd like." Lily considered this. "Can I call you Robert?" "Yes," he said. "Then yes," Lily said, and went back to her porridge with the air of someone who has made a significant administrative decision and is satisfied with it. Charlotte met Robert's eyes across the table, and he was pressing his lips together in the way he did when he was suppressing the full version of a smile, and she thought that she was going to spend the rest of her life watching him do that, and she could not imagine anything she wanted more. They were married in March of 1883 in the Caldwell church that had finally gotten around to being open more regularly since the arrival of a new minister named Reverend Cole, who was young and enthusiastic and took his work seriously. It was a quiet ceremony, exactly what Charlotte had wanted. Mrs. Hawthorne was there, and James Aldred and his wife, and Robert's colleague from the bank, and Mr. Hendricks from the neighboring property, who had leased the south pasture, and who seemed moved entirely out of proportion to his involvement in the proceedings. Lily stood beside Charlotte in a new blue dress that Charlotte had made herself, and she held Charlotte's flowers with tremendous seriousness. And when Reverend Cole got to the part about anyone having cause why these two should not be joined, Lily looked around the church with an expression that suggested she was genuinely prepared to hear arguments, and Charlotte had to compress a laugh into a very small noise in her throat. Robert's face during the ceremony was the face of a man who has arrived at a place he did not know he was looking for until he was standing in it. And when he said his vows, he said them looking directly at Charlotte with the full, unguarded attention she had loved about him from the beginning, not performing them, not saying them at her, but saying them to her for her, because of her. When the minister said, "You may kiss your bride," and Robert did, the church's handful of occupants clapped, and Lily clapped the loudest of all, which Charlotte felt somewhere in the region of her heart that had been empty for a long time and was filling up so gradually, and then so suddenly that she was caught off guard by the fullness of it. They went home to the homestead. Not to a hotel, not to anywhere else, because the homestead was what it was about, the land that Charlotte had held onto and that now held both of them. Mrs. Hawthorne took Lily for the night with enormous satisfaction, and Charlotte and Robert were alone in the house that had been hers alone for so long, and it was different with him in it. The proportions of the rooms seemed to change, not diminished, but expanded, the way a piece of music changes when more instruments join it. They sat by the stove after the sun went down, and she showed him the tin box where she kept the money, because she wanted him to know the real arithmetic of it. And he did not comment on the amount beyond saying that she had managed extraordinarily well, and she believed him because he was a man who counted money for a living and knew exactly what extraordinarily well looked like under difficult conditions. She showed him the place on the floor where the casing was cracked, and she had packed it with clay to slow the draft. She showed him the corner of the bedroom where the roof needed fresh chinking before the next winter. She showed him Thomas's boots, which she had finally set aside now that she had new ones, good ones from the general store, bought in December when she had a little to spare. He listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, with the fullness of someone who considers what they're given. And then he said, "Tell me what needs doing first." He was good with his hands, which surprised her a little. She had thought of him as a numbers man, an office man, and he was both of those things, but he had also grown up in Texas before it was fully settled, and he had built and repaired things as a matter of necessity before he had ever entered a bank. On his first full weekend at the homestead, he rechinkered the bedroom corner, fixed the fence along the east pasture, and rebuilt the chicken coop door that had been hanging crooked since December. He did not make a great show of these things. He just did them, and then came in for supper. Charlotte watched him from the kitchen window as he worked in the yard, and she thought, this is what it is. This is what she had not known she needed, not rescue, not managing, but this, someone present and capable and simply here, fitting himself into the life she had built rather than trying to replace it. The spring of 1883 was a good one. The kitchen garden came in stronger than the previous year, and Charlotte added 2 new rows of potatoes and a section of squash that would be good for selling at market by August. Robert had begun coming home for midday dinner when his schedule allowed, the bank being 4 miles from the homestead and the ride being manageable on Caesar. And on those days, he and Charlotte sat at the kitchen table in the warm noon and talked about the small and large things of the life they were building. He told her one afternoon that the bank was considering opening a small office in a neighboring town to the south, and that there was a possibility he might be asked to oversee it, which would mean more responsibility and an increase in his salary that would be significant. Charlotte listened and asked the right questions, and when he was finished, she said, "Would you want that?" He looked at her. "I would want what makes our situation more stable," he said. "That is not the same as what you want," she said. He smiled at her, the private version that she had come to think of as specifically hers. "I want to stay in Caldwell," he said. "I want to ride Caesar in the morning and come home to this table at noon on the days I'm able and sit on that porch in the evening and continue the conversation we have apparently been having since April of last year." "The conversation is rather interesting," she agreed. "It is the most interesting conversation I have ever been in," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the gesture reversed from the hotel dining room in that first autumn, and she thought of the candle flame between them and the peach pie and the two people they had been then, careful and hoping, not yet knowing what they were walking toward. "I am glad," she said, "that I walked into your bank." "I am glad," he said, "that you came in looking like you expected the floor to give way and didn't let it." They laughed together, the easy laughter of people who know each other's stories and find that knowledge funny and true and theirs. In June of 1883, Charlotte discovered she was pregnant. She did not tell Robert immediately. She sat with it for 3 days in the private space of herself, examining it from all sides the way she examined everything important, making sure she understood what she felt before she said it out loud. What she felt was enormous and complicated happiness that was deeper than any ordinary happiness, a kind of joy that was also slightly vertiginous, because she was 32 and had not thought it was something she would have again, and there was grief threaded through it for Thomas, who would never know, and love for Robert, who would, and underneath all of it the firm, solid ground of the life she had built that would now hold one more person. She told him on a Sunday evening on the porch. He was quiet for a long time after she said it, and she could not quite read the quality of the quiet, so she waited, and then he turned to look at her, and his face was open in a way she had never quite seen it, all the careful composure he wore through the world simply not there, replaced by something unguarded and grateful and wholly tender. "Charlotte," he said, and then could not continue, and she reached over and took his hand. "I know," she said. "I know." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and when he looked up again his eyes were bright. "We should tell Lily," he said. "She's going to have opinions," Charlotte said. "She has opinions about everything," he said. "It's one of the things I like about her." They told Lily the next morning, and Lily did have opinions. First she wanted to know how long it took. Then she wanted to know if it was going to be a girl. Then she wanted to know if it was going to be a girl who was loud or quiet. Then she said that she thought it should be a girl so that she could have a sister. But if it was a boy, that would also be all right, because then she would still be the most important. At which Robert pressed his lips together very firmly, and Charlotte turned to look at the window with unnecessary attention. "Whatever it is," Charlotte told her, "it will be yours to look after as well as ours." "I am very responsible," Lily said seriously. "You are," Charlotte agreed. "You are the most responsible 7-year-old I know." "I'll be 8 by the time it comes," Lily said. "That is true," Charlotte said. "An 8-year-old, that is very experienced." The pregnancy was not easy, not difficult, the ordinary business of it that women have been managing in difficult circumstances since there was a world to manage it in. Charlotte kept working through the summer and into the fall, more slowly and with more rest as needed. And Robert fussed in the quiet, practical way that did not irritate her, because it never interfered with her own authority over her body and her choices. He fussed by making sure the woodpile was always stocked well ahead of need. He fussed by coming home early more days than he had before. He fussed by reading aloud to her in the evenings from the history books he loved, which she had initially found instructive and now found deeply comforting. The sound of his voice and the lamplight and the warmth of the stove and the vast Kansas dark outside the window. Lily had decided that the baby needed to be prepared for properly, and had taken it upon herself to organize the cradle that was stored in the lean-to. She did this with a level of executive efficiency that was genuinely impressive, directing Robert to carry it in and positioning it herself, and examining it from multiple angles before deciding it was satisfactory. "It needs to be by the window," Lily said, "so that the baby can see the morning." "The baby will not be able to see very well," Charlotte said, "at first." "Then it needs to be by the window for when it can," Lily said, with the logic of someone who is planning for the long term. The baby came in January of 1884, which made it a winter baby, the same month Thomas had died, and Charlotte had thought about that, had held both things in her at the same time, the grief and the new life arriving together in the same cold month, and she had decided that this was how it worked, that the calendar does not respect the tidy arrangements of the heart, and you just hold all of it together and keep going. The baby was a boy. Robert Dawson Jr., though they called him Robbie from the first hour, because Jr. had the sound of a name carrying too much weight for a person who weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces, and had a quantity of dark hair entirely disproportionate to his size. He arrived in the early morning with Mrs. Crawford, the midwife, presiding, and Robert in the parlor with Lily asleep on the chair beside him, because Lily had refused to go to bed while something important was happening, which was completely consistent with her character. When Mrs. Crawford came out to the parlor and told Robert he had a son, Robert stood so quickly he knocked the book off the arm of the chair where it had been resting, which he did not notice until much later. He went into the bedroom, and Charlotte was in the bed, not recovered but steady, with the particular steadiness she brought to everything, and Robbie was in her arms, small and dark-haired and vehemently alive. Robert sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and Charlotte watched his face in the lamp light, and she had never seen him look like that before, wholly undone and wholly present, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen anyone's face do. "Hello," Robert said very quietly to the baby, and Robbie, who had just arrived in a loud and complicated world, seemed to find the sound of his father's voice worth paying attention to and blinked. "He likes you," Charlotte said. "He can't see me properly yet," Robert said. "He likes your voice," Charlotte said. Robert looked up at her, and the look between them was the kind that does not require words, the kind that is made of everything that has happened and is a summary of all of it. In the morning, Lily was brought in, and she stood at the side of the bed with her arms folded and looked at her brother with the expression of someone conducting a critical assessment. Then she said, "He is very small." "You were smaller," Charlotte said. "I find that hard to believe," Lily said. She reached out and touched Robbie's hand very carefully with one finger, and Robbie's hand closed around it with the instinctive grip of all new things that do not yet know how to hold on, and Lily's face did something entirely new, something soft and wide open that Charlotte would never forget. "Oh," Lily said very softly. "Yes," Charlotte said. Lily did not take her finger back for a long time. The years that followed were the years that Charlotte had not known she was building toward, that you never know you're building toward until you're inside them. They were not without difficulty, because nothing is without difficulty, especially not life on the frontier in the 1880s in Kansas, where the weather was capricious, and the economy was unsteady, and the cattle trade that had given Caldwell its pulse was beginning to shift as the railroads changed their routes. There were years when the harvest was thin and years when it was good. There was the summer when Robbie was 2 and had a fever that frightened both of them badly, and 3 days that were the longest days Charlotte had ever spent. And then the fever broke and Robbie opened his eyes and demanded water in a voice that was already developing the particular clarity of someone who knows what he wants. And Charlotte and Robert sat together in the chairs by the bed with their hands interlaced and simply breathed. Robert was made partner in the First Territorial Bank in 1885, when the original owners restructured and offered the partnership to the 3 managers they considered most valuable, and this brought a significant increase in their stability that Charlotte marked in the practical way she marked everything, by rebuilding the henhouse to proper specifications and adding a second room to the house that Lily had been campaigning for since the arrival of Robbie. Lily, who was 10 in 1885, had opinions about the new room's construction that she provided freely and which Robert, who was directing the work himself with the help of 2 men from town, incorporated without complaint because she was almost always right about spatial matters. The new room was Lily's own, and she received it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has understood for some time that she deserved it and is pleased to have been proven correct. James Aldred, the lawyer who had helped Charlotte with the Curtis Hale situation, and whom Robert had described as an acquaintance with such careful distinction, became a genuine friend to both of them in those years, and his wife Margaret became the first real friend Charlotte had made since coming to Caldwell. Charlotte had been slow to trust, slow to let anyone close, not out of coldness, but out of the self-protective instinct of a woman who had had to be enough for herself for a long time. Margaret Aldred was patient with this in the way of a woman who recognized it because she had her own version of it, and their friendship grew slowly and became the kind that is better the older it gets. Charlotte began, in 1886, to keep a more formal set of accounts for the homestead, using the bookkeeping knowledge she had taught herself from Thomas's manual and building on it with what she had learned from watching Robert, and from the questions she asked him, and from a book on agricultural accounting she had ordered by mail from a publisher in St. Louis. She had an eye for numbers, always had, and the discipline of the accounts gave her a clarity about the homestead's position that she found deeply satisfying. By 1887, she could say with precision that the land was profitable, not by great margins, but consistently and reliably, and the note to the First Territorial Bank was in its final year. She paid it off in the summer of 1888. 6 years after the morning, she had walked through the bank's door not knowing if she would come out the other side with anything. The final payment was $58.40, which she had saved over the preceding quarter with the deliberate accumulation of a woman who has been saving money with intention for most of her adult life. She went to the bank on a Tuesday morning, which was appropriate, because it had been a Tuesday morning when everything began. Robert was at his desk. He was not her bank manager any longer in any conflicted sense. Another man, a younger man named Sutton, handled their personal accounts, but Robert was there in his office behind the wooden railing with the swinging gate, and when Charlotte came through it with the money in an envelope she had addressed to the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell with her own name written in the line for the account holder, he stood up. "Final payment," she said. He took the envelope. He counted the money with the practiced ease he had always had with numbers, and he entered it in the ledger, and he marked the account closed with the particular notation that meant the debt was retired and the obligation fulfilled and the record complete. Then he took a piece of paper from the drawer and wrote on it with his bank pen, and he blotted it and folded it and handed it across the desk to her. She unfolded it. It said, in Robert's clear, even hand, "Paid in full. The land is yours." It was always yours. She looked up at him. He was standing across the desk with his hands at his sides, and his expression was the same expression he had been wearing the day she had first met his gaze across this same desk, careful, warm, and fully attending. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, where she would carry it until she got home, and put it in the tin box, where it would remain, alongside the bank letter from April of 1882, and the paper record of the extension and a receipt she had never thrown away from a supper at the Caldwell Hotel for 2 chickens and 2 peach pies. "Thank you," she said. "Always," he said. She went home through the Caldwell morning, through the streets that were noisier than they had been in 1882 and also somehow more familiar, past the general store and the livery and the church and the hotel, past all the ordinary permanent things of a life lived in a place long enough to know it. And she tied Jericho, the same impossible mule, still in service at 14 years old through sheer stubbornness. outside her own gate and went into her own house. Lily was in the kitchen, at 12 years old, managing the morning bread with the competence she brought to any domestic task she had decided to take ownership of. Robbie was outside with Robert, who had come home early, ostensibly to fix the water pump, but actually, Charlotte suspected, because he had known what morning this was. She stood in the kitchen door and watched Robert in the yard, crouched down with Robbie beside him looking at the pump mechanism, explaining something to the boy who was listening with the focused intensity he had inherited from both of them. Robbie was 4 years old, built compact and solid, with Charlotte's eyes and Robert's jaw and a personality that was still assembling itself into whatever it was going to be, which so far looked like it was going to be curious about everything and afraid of nothing, which seemed right. "Well," Lily said, not looking up from her bread. "Paid," Charlotte said. Lily let out a breath that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh. "About time," she said, which was not what Charlotte had expected, but then Lily rarely was. "You knew about this," Charlotte said. "Robert told me," Lily said. "I am 12, Mama. I know how money works." Charlotte looked at her daughter, who was 12 and managing the bread, and knew how money worked, and had come 4 miles in Thomas's boots on an April morning in 1882 inside her mother's body. Not yet born, but already there. The most compelling reason Charlotte had for holding on. She thought about all the holding on, all the getting through, all the early mornings and late nights and hard seasons, and the moment in the bank when she had not begged but had simply told the truth about what she needed. She thought about Robert at his desk, looking up from his ledger, standing before she had finished sitting down. She crossed the yard. Robert looked up when he heard her. Robbie looked up too, and then immediately went back to the pump mechanism because it was clearly more interesting. Charlotte stood in front of Robert, and he read her face the way he had always read her face, with the fluency of someone who has studied one subject long and well. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against him, and they stood in the yard of the Gentry homestead on Salt Creek in Caldwell, Kansas, on a morning in the summer of 1888, and the land stretched out around them in the August light, golden and flat and impossibly wide, 160 acres of promise that had been borrowed against and fought for, and held through grief and weather and the particular hard grace of time, and it was theirs. Not in the way that a bank balance is yours, but in the way that something is yours when you have paid for it with the actual substance of your living. Lily called from the kitchen window that the bread was ready. Robbie, who had located a grasshopper near the pump, made a significant announcement about this in the manner of someone who has made a discovery of global importance. Robert pressed his lips briefly to the top of Charlotte's head. "Come and have breakfast," he said. "In a minute," she said. She stayed in the yard a moment longer, looking at the horizon the way she had been looking at the horizon all her adult life, not waiting for something to come from it, but recognizing it, the wideness of it, the particular endless quality of the Kansas sky that had once seemed to her simply like a lot of space, and had come over the years to feel like something much closer to freedom. Then she went inside to her family, to the warm kitchen and the bread and the noise of a morning in a house full of people she loved, and the door closed behind her with the solid, ordinary, permanent sound of a life that was fully and completely hers. They had another child 2 years later, in the winter of 1890, a girl this time, which delighted Lily with an intensity that surprised no one. They named her Grace, which was Charlotte's choice, because that was the word she kept returning to when she tried to describe the thing that had gotten her through everything, the grace of being given time when she needed it, the grace of a man who asked for nothing but supper, the grace of finding that the world, even at its most difficult, sometimes leaves a door open for you if you come to it honestly. Grace was born in January, which meant Charlotte had 2 winter babies, and she thought of Thomas on both of those January mornings and was not sad, not exactly, but tender in the way you are tender with things that are past and precious and have made you what you are. She thought he would have liked Robert, which was the right kind of thought to have, the generous kind, the kind that honors what was by allowing what is. Lily, who was 15 when Grace arrived, took on the baby's care with the executive efficiency she brought to everything, and Grace responded to this by being an easy, cheerful baby who seemed to find her large sister's particular brand of management entirely acceptable. Robbie, who was 6, inspected Grace once with thorough attention and then announced that she was acceptable and went back to whatever project he had been in the middle of, which that week was an ambitious plan to build a dam in the irrigation ditch that Robert had gently redirected. The homestead expanded over those years in the careful, deliberate way that something grows when it is tended properly. A proper barn replaced the leaning original. The chicken flock was rebuilt to 20. Charlotte's kitchen garden became a proper kitchen garden by any standard, with its own root cellar and a second plot of ground she put into sweet corn. The south pasture continued to be leased to Hendricks each summer, and the relationship had become something between a business arrangement and a friendship, the kind that forms between neighbors who have been useful to each other long enough. Robert continued at the bank through the changes that came to Caldwell as the cattle trade shifted and the town's character evolved. The Kishom Trail was no longer what it had been by the late 1880s, the railroads having reorganized the patterns of the beef industry, and Caldwell adjusted to this with the pragmatic resilience of a place that has survived enough hard years to know how to pivot. Robert had a hand in some of that adjustment, in the conversations between the bank and the town's merchants about how to build a more diversified local economy, and Charlotte listened to these conversations at the supper table with genuine interest and offered opinions that he took seriously, which she appreciated and he considered simply reasonable. Lily grew up and grew capable and left for Wichita in 1893 at 18 to work as a school teacher, which was what she had decided she was going to do at approximately age 10 and had not deviated from. Charlotte drove her to the stage with the feeling of someone who has successfully completed a very large and important piece of work, and is proud of the result and heartbroken in equal measure. Lily hugged her mother with the fierceness of someone who has always loved deeply, but has not always been demonstrative about it, and she hugged Robert with the same fierceness, and she crouched down and told 8-year-old Robbie and 3-year-old Grace that she was leaving them in charge, which was the right thing to say to both of them. She wrote every week without fail and came home for Christmas and for summers when the school was not in session, and she brought stories of Wichita and the children she taught and the friendships she was making, and Charlotte read every letter twice and kept them all in a box in the bedroom, alongside the tin box and the paid-in-full note and the small accumulated archive of a life that had been worth having. By 1895, the homestead was something that could be called, without exaggeration, thriving. The debt was long gone. The land was fully Charlotte's, paid in full and clear in the records, free of any claim or contest, 160 acres along Salt Creek that had been borrowed against in 1876 and fought for in 1882 and held through every year since by the simple determined refusal to let go. Robbie was 11 and already helping with the real work of the place, not as a lesson but as genuine labor, the kind that a boy does when he has grown up watching both his parents take the land seriously. Grace was 5 and had the sunny, stubborn temperament of someone who has never had to be the oldest, but has watched the oldest closely enough to pick up the useful parts. Robert was 50 years old in 1896 and still rode Caesar every morning, though Caesar was getting gray around the muzzle, and moved with the dignified deliberation of an older horse that knows it has earned the right to set its own pace. Charlotte was 45 and had the face of a woman who had spent years in the Kansas sun and wind, and did not regret any of them, a face that was lined in the particular way of someone who has been both outdoors and genuinely happy in roughly equal measure. On a Sunday evening in September of 1896, they sat on the porch in the last warm weeks before fall properly arrived, and the grasslands were gold, and the sky was doing the specific Kansas thing it does in September, where the blue goes so deep it looks like it continues forever in both directions. Robbie was somewhere in the south pasture. Grace was asleep inside, small and warm in her room. Robert was in his chair with a book he was not reading, which meant he was thinking. Charlotte was mending, which she had done on Sunday evenings for so many years that the motion of it was purely automatic and left her mind free. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "About the morning you walked into the bank," he said. She looked up at him. The September light was very kind to his face, making him look like the man she had first looked at across an oak desk, and also entirely like the man she had been looking at every day for 14 years, both of these things true at once. "What about it?" she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "that it is the luckiest morning I have ever had." Charlotte set down her mending. She looked at him across the porch with the expression that was specifically hers, the one that was not quite a smile but was warmer than everything that is not a smile, the one that lived on her face when she was about to say something true. "You gave me 60 days, she said. "That was very nearly the single greatest gift I have ever been given." "You would have found another way," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "but I did not have to." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had been reaching over and taking her hand for 14 years, in the hotel and on the porch and at the kitchen table and in the yard and in the dark of every night that had been theirs together. And she held it the way she held everything that mattered to her, firmly and without reserve. The stars came out over the Kansas plain one by one, then all at once, the way they do in that country where there is nothing between you and the sky, and the grasslands went dark and warm-smelling, and the porch held both of them in the particular piece of people who have come through many things and are on the other side of them, solid ground underfoot, and the night spread out ahead like a gift that has not yet been fully opened. Charlotte Gentry, who had once driven 4 miles in borrowed boots to beg for time and had not begged, and who had walked out of the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, Kansas, with 60 days and an invitation to supper and the very beginning of something she had not known she was walking toward, sat in the September evening with her husband's hand in hers and felt the land beneath her feet and the house behind her and the life around her, full and real and hers, fully and finally and forever hers. And she thought that it was enough. She thought that it was more than enough. She thought that, when you boil it all down to the true thing, this was it, the hand in yours and the land beneath your feet and the children inside, and the stars coming out in the country you chose to stay in, because staying was what love asks of you, and you had it in you to give. She squeezed Robert's hand. He squeezed back without looking up from the horizon he was watching. They sat together in the September dark, and the world was quiet around them, and it was good. It was genuinely and completely good, and there was nothing left to want that was not already there.